Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time to participate in our webinar to present our latest achievement on our VAT activities. That is our new report focusing on value chain approaches to determining VAT for industrial installations. And I'm Koki Takaki, an OECD administrator for the VAT project. The OECD has launched the expert group on VAT in 2016 and organized the VAT project since then by sharing experience, knowledge, and best practices on this topic among OECD member and partner countries, and summarizes the results as some reports, as a series of reports, including the guidance document, which describes how to establish the VAT policy or how to determine the VAT from various techniques and how to set the VAT associated environmental limit value and VAT-based environmental permit. The report we are now presenting today is part of our activities focused on value chain approaches to determining VAT. So usually VAT are determined in assessing their effectiveness to reduce pollution emission and releases, as well as other environmental impact at the industrial installation level. But this document highlighted the importance of value chain consideration. That is, to expand your focus, selecting the technologies that could contribute to reduce environmental impact, not only at the installation level, but also considering the whole value chain effect. And based on this idea, we have explored how to develop and incorporate the value chain approach in VAT policies, which result in this latest publication. So today, we are introducing the overview and some essences of the latest report in collaboration with the US EPA, who has been drafting this report. In addition, we are inviting very attractive to external speakers to explore how to proceed further with the value chain approach. This session focuses on textile sector, which was addressed in the report as well as one of the case studies. Both speakers are experts in addressing value chain impact in this sector and have much experience in it. Jan Berak will introduce them after my speech. And we also have 2 discussion sessions to reflect on the report's contents and input from the presenters. So I would very much appreciate it if you, all the participants, could provide us your suggestions and comments about the next steps of our project. So, okay, that's all from my end at the beginning of the webinar. And I hand it to my colleague Berak. She will present some technical instruction for the Zoom webinar first, and then she will present the overview of our activities. So Berak, go ahead, floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Koki. So warm welcome from my side to our webinar today as well. And before we begin our webinar, I'd like to give you some information about the functionalities of the Zoom that you can use. Firstly, during the presentation, if you have any question that you'd like to be answered, please send your questions using the Q&A function. And so we don't lose your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical or other useful information that you'd like to share with everyone, please feel free to send them using the chat function. And later, when we will have a discussion session, if you would like to take the floor, please feel free to raise your hands using the raise hand function. So we will unmute you accordingly. And during the webinar, if you have any other problems or any questions, please feel free to contact Hannah by the chat function or by email. And as Koki, I don't know if he mentioned, we will record this webinar and we will make it available afterwards at the OECD's webpage for the VAT website. And with that, I'd like to start our webinar by introducing our speakers. First, we have 2 speakers from US EPA. Sandra will will briefly introduce US EPA's work on that. And later, Charlotte will take over to introduce the value chain concept and 4 of the approaches that we have mentioned in our report. And later, we will give the floor to Lars, who will introduce the value chain impacts for textiles consumption in the EU and related policies. And finally, we will give the floor to Valerie, who will talk about the rethinking business models for fashion industry. And with that, I would like to also give you a brief introduction to today's program. Firstly, I will introduce the OECD's work on that and the project and the expert group. And later, as I said, Sandra will introduce the US EPA's work on that. And Charlie will talk about the value chain and its concept that we have covered within the Activity 5 report. Further than that, we will include some introductions to challenges faced by the regulatory bodies and industrial installations. And then we will provide some solutions for integrating value chain approaches to national VAT policies that we have covered within the report. And then we would like to pass the floor to the participants who can share some information about if they have any initiatives or projects for implementing value chain approaches within their countries. And following that, we will pass the floor to 2 of our speakers who will introduce their projects on value chain concepts. And as Koki said, finally, we will have a discussion session where we'll answer your questions if you have any. So I'd like to begin by OECD's Best Available Techniques project. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the objectives of what we do here. Our main objectives are to exchange best practices across countries that already have a VAT-based permitting system. And we provide guidance to those countries that seek to adopt VAT-based approaches for the first time or just beginning to introduce it within their national systems. And through these 2 objectives, we're trying to progress towards the SDGs, notably the target 12.4 on the environmental sound management of chemicals. How we do that? We have an expert group on that. We established this expert group back in 2015, and ever since it's increased a lot. And currently we have approximately 150 members from more than 40 countries and organizations. So the best part of this expert group is that we don't only have OECD member countries, but we also have experts from non-member governments. We have participations from intergovernmental organizations, environmental NGOs, and as well as industrial associations. Under normal circumstances, we have once a year face-to-face meeting and once a year webinar. And unfortunately, we didn't get to do the face-to-face meeting due to COVID circumstances. But aside those 2 meetings, 2 official meetings, we frequently exchange between our members by emails or by Skype calls. So overall, this expert group on that is actually a very fruitful platform for exchanging best practices among the countries, the organizations, NGOs, and industrial associations that feel like they can share or also raise questions to should be shared within the expert group as well. So far, within the OECD's VAT project that's been running for a couple of years, we are almost over with our phase 2. So within the phase 1, which ran from 2016 to 2019, we have published 3 reports, basically trying to grasp the idea that is present in the world on VAT. And the phase 2 had more specific objectives in carrying VAT projects. And currently, this webinar is going to be focusing on the Activity 5, which is, as you can see there, it's the study on value chain aspects on determining VAT. You can access all of the 5 reports at our website. You can see the link here. And very recently, we're going to publish our final report of phase 2, which will be cross-country comparisons of selected graphs. And when we complete the phase 2 quite soon, we're going to begin our phase 3, which will run for further 2 years. And as I said, this webinar is focusing on the Activity 5 report that you can download from our website. And we also have an infographic that basically what we're going to focus on to explain within the report at this webinar as well. And with that, I would like to pass the floor to Sandra to introduce US EPA's work on that. Let me stop sharing.
Hi, Sandra.
Excellent. Thank you, Barak. Okay, I'll go ahead now. Well, greetings, everyone. It's wonderful that you can join us for this important event. And first off, let me start out by thanking you, Barak and Koki, and others at OECD for organizing this webinar and for your leadership with OECD's BAT work. I also want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to collaborate closely on the development of this Activity 5 report. Initially, you actually supported the development of a green chemistry-oriented research endeavor, and the outcome that we see today is much improved since conceptualized and really reflective of the many resources available to expanding the BAT determination lens. So kudos to all. In terms of the BAT activities that the US EPA is doing, the agency has a renewed focus on protecting the environment and public health, especially the most vulnerable or historically underserved or marginalized populations. And we are protecting through a preventative and environmentally preferable means. So there are many activities going on at the agency to address these priorities and these areas of concern. And specific to my office, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, and within that, the Data Gathering and Analysis Division, we are focused on leveraging information. And that is to advance the adoption of pollution prevention practices across a product's life cycle, from design to manufacture to consumer use and ultimate disposition and reclamation. As an example, as a means to improve the reporting and the use of source reduction information that's reported to the Toxics Release Inventory Program, that is the Pollutant Release and Transfer Registry Program for the US, we updated the codes that are used by industry to report any activities that they implement in a given year. We condensed those codes and then also updated guidance to help direct them towards reporting and any activities that they may implement. So we expect greater data quality as a result of this, and also greater insight into the adoption of BAT. In addition, within our office, there's increased emphasis on tech transfer and providing businesses with resources to aid in implementing alternative chemicals and processes that lead to greater efficiencies and reduced pollution. So much of this assistance occurs through grant programs, and these are provided to local authorities such as state governments or state universities. So the use of voluntary mechanisms, that is the data gathering through the pollutant release and transfer registries, eco-labeling, recognition programs, the technical assistance programs, are some of the many ways that my office is engaged in advancing or encouraging and assisting industry towards their trajectory towards more sustainable practices. Well, that'll conclude my remarks in terms of what the US is doing, and I thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about our work.
Thank you, Sandra, so much. And so now I'll move on to the session about introducing the contents, the overview or report, and focusing on each chapter one by one. So the first chapter is on the value chain and its concept to be presented by Charlotte Snyder from the US EPA, who was involved in drafting this document. So Charlie, are you ready?
Yes, sorry, let me arrange my screens correctly.
Okay, so the floor is to you.
Great, thank you. Can you guys see the correct window?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I will be introducing the value chain as a concept and also the value chain concepts that we used to potentially expand BAT determination. So I'll cover a brief definition of the value chain, cover some of the concepts that we looked at, describe commonalities between these value chain approaches, and then what implementation and integration into VAT determination might mean. So the value chain represents all value-added steps required to create a product or service. So we generally think of these as vertical linkages that are the stepwise creation of the product, generally starting with procurement of raw materials and ending with waste management. There are also horizontal links in the value chain that might represent similar processes to provide goods or services to the same customer or consumer. Value chains tend to be more expansive than supply chains and include things like transport or logistics, really anything that adds value to a product during its life cycle. So a business as usual value chain tends to look like a straight line, starting with extraction of raw materials, manufacturing, distribution, consumer use, and end of life. So that would generally begin and end with these red arrows in this diagram here. Whereas a sustainable model would loop back into itself, where materials are recovered and waste streams are valorized to supplant the use of virgin materials for production. So here we see strategies such as recycling materials and components, recovering them to replace the extraction of raw materials, and then reusing materials or products to extend their use and maintenance. So we holistically considered the industrial value chain to look for opportunities to reduce the environmental impact of the full value chain rather than the typical strategy of considering single links in the value chain independently. So in our paper, we looked at vertically linked value chains. So for example, we examined the textiles value chain. So this would include looking at things like upstream chemical manufacturing, polymer production for synthetic fibers, textiles themselves, and then downstream operations like waste treatment and recovery. We considered 4 concepts to examine links in the value chain. And overall, we're looking at how these concepts might be leveraged systematically during VAT determination for one industrial sector to minimize the impacts of the value chain to which that sector belongs. So our first concept is green chemistry. It's a set of guiding principles to design chemical products or processes. It's closely related to other concepts like sustainable chemistry or green engineering. And the principles relate to reducing or eliminating the generation of waste and use of hazardous substances during a product's life cycle. So our top diagram represents sort of business as usual chemistry. We see energy, solvents, and reagents and substrates going into a chemical process. And then the output of this process are products and waste. But as we can see here, the quantity of waste sometimes really dwarfs the quantity of products that you derive from a process. So green chemistry seeks to sort of balance the outputs of a chemical process more in favor of the products. So here we see that waste generation is minimal and most material inputs end up as products. So strategies to achieve this and minimize the environmental impact of a process also include minimizing energy inputs, so making sure that these processes operate close to ambient conditions, catalysis, and things like recycling solvents and catalysts, as well as reagents to ensure that they're really spent before they go to the waste stream. Next, we considered resource efficiency. So obviously, definitions of resource efficiency can vary greatly, but we can really think of it as the ratio of benefit derived, oftentimes in the form of a product, to the quantity of resources used as an input. So to increase resource efficiency is to deliver greater value from less input. So here we see a system that links the natural environment with production and consumption. So natural resources flow into production, and then useful outputs are delivered to the consumer. So increasing resource efficiency here means that we see fewer natural resources required for production and fewer emissions going back to the environment as more of our starting materials end up in the output. Where waste streams are created, they're valorized to be a useful resource for the production system. Circular economy is pretty similar to our sustainable value chain model. It seeks to close material flows through recycling and remanufacturing. Additionally, circularity requires minimal reliance on non-renewable resources. Where they are used, they must be recycled and looped back into the system. The circular economy distinguishes between biological and technical cycles. So here in the schematic, we see on the left-hand side, biological cycles, and on the right-hand side, technical cycles. So biological cycles describe the movement of bio-based materials through a circular economy. So agricultural products are harvested and used to create feedstocks. And this system ultimately feeds back into itself through composting and anaerobic digestion, for example, to replenish the natural systems and ensure future productivity. Technical cycles describe the movement and creation of products generally through manufacturing. And so circular technical systems keep products in use longer through reuse, repair, and remanufacturing, and materials are recovered and recycled to ensure future supplies. While this image sort of presents biological and technical cycles as distinct from each other, they're obviously very interrelated. Feedstocks from biological cycles may play really important roles in manufacturing products that move through technical cycles. Decarbonization is our next strategy. It's a climate change mitigation strategy, and it's generally focused on the power supply. But it relies on two main strategies. So one is to supplant the use of fossil fuels for power generation with renewable resources, and to implement carbon capture and storage. So these strategies apply to any sector that requires power generation. So the main strategy to decarbonize most sectors is to meet their energy requirements through decarbonized power supplies. Some other important strategies are hydrogen as fuel and electrification. True decarbonization obviously means that the energy requirement for hydrogen or electricity generation must be met through decarbonized power sources. So this requires really broad consideration of the value chain. Energy generation touches all parts of it. So all of these concepts examine processes and interactions to find opportunities to improve their sustainability. The interactions might be upstream of an installation, such as resource extraction and production of raw materials, or downstream, such as consumer use and ultimate disposal. But the value chain concepts can identify mutually beneficial interactions that capture and reuse resources to minimize hazard associated with industrial processes and end-of-life management, for instance. And overall, these concepts are united with the goal of achieving sustainability through pollution prevention, material recovery, recycling, and hazard reduction. So we found these themes among the four concepts were common among all of them: waste prevention and minimization, resource efficiency, use of renewable feedstocks and raw materials, material recycling and recovery, and hazard reduction. So integrating these approaches and concepts into VAT determination and implementing at the installation level may lead to many benefits, such as alternative inputs to chemicals that are safer and processes that minimize the generation of hazardous waste, especially where there are chemicals of concern. Renewable inputs to industrial processes, such as bio-based materials, valorized waste streams, and other secondary materials. Processes that use materials, energy, and water more efficiently, and products that are designed with end-of-life point. That's it for my presentation. I'll hand it off to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. And then the next presentation is by Vera to present the next chapter of the report challenges faced by the regulatory bodies and industry installation.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. So thank you very much. And I'll continue on our other chapter that focuses on challenges associated with value chain concept consideration. And yeah. So the first question that comes to mind is if actually bad policy is the best place to integrate these value chain concepts in the environmental regulation. To begin with, as the regulators, we start by considering the options within the already existing frameworks and actually what happens after their implementation. The two challenges that we know at first glance are what is within the facilities control, and the other point could be like more general problems such as access to information. And I can click, yeah. And when we raise these questions at the bad determination level, it may also significantly influence what is already a complex process of developing bad reference documents. Yeah. And if I particularly start on challenges at the installation level, there are also factors outside of the facilities control as well. In general, a facility is regulated through one particular installation specific permit that controls what happens within the installation's boundaries. And sometimes they also cover the inputs that the facility receives as well. So beyond these premises, we need extra efforts to learn about what happens when the product leaves the facility. Another factor that could be the operators working at the facility may also have no knowledge or even maybe no control over the uses of the products that they produce at the facility. So these gaps of information are getting more highlighted and in the recent years and maybe more, but because product stewardship has gained more attention for many reasons. To start with, and now we know we know that we can trace the impact of a product back to the producer themselves. So although the importance of downstream is undeniable, there's still very important, but there's still an understanding that the responsibility of the product is transferred once the product leaves the facility. So having said that, establishing strong business relations with suppliers and engaging in cooperative practices to develop solutions are important steps to help installations perhaps reduce their environmental footprint. Yeah, since I also touched upon it in the previous slide, there is also limited information available about the uses of the products, whether they have broader or narrow uses. When we consider the possible ways of uses of a product, we have to understand that its applications can change from industry to industry, even between the installations themselves. So from the perspective of upstream facilities, it is very difficult to collect the information impacts of all the use cases of their products for downstream activities. So we can assume that it is much simpler for the installations to focus on downstream product uses. And to begin evaluating and minimizing the environmental impacts of downstream product use, we have to have its inventory of chemical uses. So for that, there are already existing resources available, which contain information on the use of chemicals and even the chemical products in industrial settings. I only gave two of the examples that we've included within our report. One of which is ECHA's database, and the other one is UN's DHS. So we can say that as the countries and regulators begin or already have accepted a standardized way of providing information, this can also improve the level of communication on chemicals and their hazards. We also have to think about the additional expenses of applying value chain concepts for the facilities as well, and whether these benefits are only visible at the downstream of the installation. So these externalized benefits may not even impact the environmental performance of the facility in terms of their pollution prevention or emission controls. For example, if the facility has to use a certain amount of secondary raw materials, but these cost more than the virgin material itself, this does not create a good initiative for the market or for the facility itself. So we know a very well-known example of the situation is seen in the plastics value chain, where secondary plastics are more expensive than the virgin plastics. So we can say that in the cases where advancements are encouraged but are not essential for operations, incentives may be used to promote adopting a technology or process modifications. Also, we can consider the influences of public and customer choices, which can influence the strategies of corporate sustainability actions. As I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, the challenges faced at the installation level influences the already difficult process of BREF development. BREF documents take great collaboration and cooperation of many stakeholders from various backgrounds, such as industry, NGOs, regulatory and permitting authorities. So a good balanced mix of experts are needed and represented in these technical group meetings. Beyond that, the main challenge faced is the pace of the regulatory development versus the technological advancements within the sectors. BAT determinations take many years to develop, and a lot of work is done. And so adding new criteria on top of the existing pressure to keep up with the technology may even extend the duration of this BAT development process. And we have to also consider that there may be, and in some countries, there are strong hold of existing regulatory frameworks on the scope set for the BREFs, which can actually make them hard to modify, and that could limit the coverage of these reference documents towards more value chain inclusive. Well, we know that integrating value chain considerations within a single BREF is very difficult to begin with. So given our need to focus on sector-specific points, perhaps working on multiple BATs can be easy way to overcome this problem to address both upstream and downstream activities. Overall, we have to keep all of these installation level and regulatory level challenges in mind when we take the initiative to expand the scopes of BREFs with more value chain concept inclusion. And I think this covers up all the challenges that I would like to mention and taken from our report. Not only the problems we have covered, we also have the challenge, aside the challenges that we provided, there are also possible benefits of integrating value chain concepts in the BAT determination. And I'd like to explain a few of them that we have covered within our report. So we can start by looking at what we already have, and we can ask, how do we effectively utilize existing resources to facilitate value chain approaches? Well, we know that existing BAT and BREF production processes already have strengths which we can build upon. So starting with the flow of information within installations and between suppliers and customers are key points in considering value chain approaches for minimizing environmental impacts at the installation level. So I've just provided one example, one strategy from our report for introducing circular economy-based approaches to BAT determination, which is CLIS, Circular Economy Labeling and Information Schemes. So CLIS facilitates enhanced information sharing between all the partners of value chain, and which enables better management of environmental related risks and uncertainties within the supply chain. One example of CLIS is business-to-business labels, which I believe many people are aware of, that are used for information transfer between businesses, either upstream or downstream. Upstream could be, for example, for sustainable sourcing of materials, and downstream would be for different end-of-life purposes and perhaps waste management. So many of the business-to-business schemes seek to optimize environmental performance at the installation level. And one example would be like facilitating enforcement of already defined standards, emission limits. So what I can say is in the context of BAT implementation, such schemes could encourage industrial installations to consider value chain aspects when seeking compliance with their BAT-based permit conditions. Beyond this intervention, we propose that a similar scheme can be set up at the BAT determination process itself and associated BAT determination and associated environmental performance levels for the sector to supply information for the decision-making level when they're determining that. So we also know that there may be hesitancy by the industry to share their technological or best practice information openly due to concerns about intellectual property rights or simply due to competitive reasons. So we propose that this may be overcome by perhaps more actively promotion of example best practices and award programs that identifies these facilities. And it could promote better information sharing for those installations too. And in addition to using information schemes like CLIS, we can also promote relevant programs and regulations. One could be perhaps leveraging trusted eco-label approaches. These could help shifting decision-making to more sustainable alternatives and limiting the downstream impacts due to consumer or industrial uses. As governments and organizations try to develop a more standard way of environmental performance labels of products, BAT policies could consider utilizing a defined set of trusted labels like what we have said. And other idea that we propose is that providing information on relevant regulations or programs could lead to better assessment and implementation of value chain concepts. These voluntary practices, for example, consumer product labeling, chemical use and release reporting, could also be included in REF documents to present more detailed information of industrial operations. Another existing resource that we can utilize are tools like life cycle analysis and input-output models. These tools could be used to a greater extent for BAT determinations because they can help tracking and managing resources along with helping to find pollution prevention opportunities for the installations as well. And since we talked about many ways of applying value chain concepts, but at the end, it is important to have a standardized method for considering relevant chain interactions. So we can start by looking at already existing indicators or metrics used globally. Industries can be encouraged to use harmonized metrics as well as maintaining a public accountability and also increase their communication along the supply chain. In the context of BAT determination, industries can be motivated to provide some product information. One example could be as product production phase information, which can be the metrics that are specific to the industrial activities. And these could be like country of origin, type of energy, quantity, and the energy quantity consumed to produce it, water usage, impact on global warming, so on and so forth. And another piece of information on the products that can be provided is the product's use phase, which can also be made available too. These could cover points like the toxicity on the body or health, levels of contaminants, biodegradability, potential to be recycled and reused on the products as well. And since we talked about possible ways of integrating value chain concepts in BAT determination for installations, and I also provided some views from regulatory perspective as well. But you might ask, how do we actually start doing this? So we have to consider that in order to integrate a value chain concept during the consideration of a candidate BAT. The candidate BAT can be assessed firstly for its technological feasibility, secondly, impact on the environment, and thirdly, its economic feasibility that covers its impact on the value chain on more of a qualitative basis. An initial step, then after could be firstly strengthening the existing legislations or policies to be more inclusive of the value chain concepts. A simple example to this could be perhaps adding another chapter in the regulatory documents on value chain at sector level. And secondly, we still need to build on our knowledge of possible interactions between different processes in the value chain itself. So industrial cluster studies may help us improve our understanding of connected industries. An example to cluster would be perhaps food industry, agriculture industry, fertilizer industry, and feed industry altogether. So we can learn key environmental aspects of connected value chain, and which can help us identify more information on cross-sector effects and target value chain BAT. Beyond this, we can also identify situations where such sector coupling might be also mutually beneficial for those countries, for those industries as well. So a third option that we came up is could be producing value chain graphs over sectorial focus documents. So these value chain graphs will be more inclusive of value chain considerations and global issues like what Charlie already mentioned within our report, resource efficiency, decarbonization, furthermore, like waste management and product stewardships that I mentioned. So in addition to all of these initial steps, well, coupled with identifying relevant indicators or metrics, perhaps a list of questions can be developed as reminders of value chain factors for both specific to installations and for the upstream and downstream activities of a sector. Developing a screening criteria also could facilitate helping more value chain thinking, and this could also lead sector BAT to be considered with a wider scope that is inclusive of the value chain concepts. So although our study, Activity 5 report, focused on applying value chain approaches to industrial sector BAT, we think that in principle, these points can also be applied to broader developments, such as the ones that I've listed here, city planning, energy and waste strategy development, and so on and so forth. So as value chain concepts and resources still do need further research, we think that there is a great potential to identify more consistent and effective ways of evaluating strategies for BAT determination. And I think with that, I'd like to pass the floor back to Koki, and that concludes my points here.
Thank you. Excellent, Vera. Yep. Now we have looked through all the contents of the document from start to end in this 30 minutes. That's very efficient, isn't it? And if you got interested in the particular parts of the document, please do find our latest reports. The link is provided on the chat box. You can easily find our written report. So another time to open the floor, and I'd like to invite several national delegates who are involved in the national VAT policies, and as well as who are involved in our VAT communities. So if some national delegates would like to make an intervention to share your ideas or reflections on the presentation, and as well as our documental activities, and or share your ideas how to implement the value chain concept into your national VAT policies, please do raise your hand and I will give you the floor. Oh, so now I see the hand from Alex Radway from the European Commission, and Alex has been kindly supervising the OECD VAT activities that we always appreciated. And he's in charge of the implementation of EU Industrial Emission Directive, which is, of course, VAT-based policy on environmental permit. So I hope to hear that how the EU reflects and will reflect value chain approach into their policy. So Alex, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Koki. Thank you, Berak. And good afternoon to everyone. And good day to those of you in other parts of the world. Yes, so here in the European Union, we have a system called the Industrial Emissions Directive, which is the main regulatory control on the impact of large agro-industrial activities. I think it's a fairly traditional and a fairly common approach to industrial pollution control in that it deals with sort of a conceptual sort of boundary defined by the fence around an installation. So really the controls start when raw materials are brought into a site, and those controls end when waste and products leave the installation boundary. And those sort of controls that we have, they're really defined at the moment in sort of Article 11 of our directive, and that talks about using sort of preventative measures against pollution, about using best available techniques. But we have given a lot of consideration to this, and we have recently tabled a proposal to modify the Industrial Emissions Directive for the EU. And that includes the addition in the general obligations on all operators for them to consider the supply chain in the overall environmental performance of their installation. And that would sort of be delivered through what we call environmental management systems. This is already a requirement that we identify in most of our best available technique documents. So there's always a BAT conclusion on the adoption of environmental management systems. But we're sort of trying to strengthen that requirement by making, again, particular reference to life cycle and environmental performance of the supply chain. So it's maybe a slightly softer way of delivering life cycle requirements, i.e. through this sort of management system rather than sort of hard permit requirements. But it's certainly something that we're trying to address. I mean, just to stress that this is just a proposal at the moment, a European Commission proposal, and it has to go through a formal legislative process over the next year to year and a half. But it's something we're very actively thinking about at EU level. Okay, I'll hand back to you now, Koki.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Really wonderful feedback from you. And I'm really happy to hear that you are now addressing somehow the inclusion of the value chain approach into the amendment process of the EU Industrial Emission Directives. Yeah, and thank you so much. And I'm happy to hear that. Okay, so the next hand is Anderden. I see the hand from Anderden, from Vito, Belgium. So Anne is always active to be involved in our discussion. And Vito not only participates in the process of the EU REF development, but also develops their own BAT study report. And I think they firstly tried to include value chain interaction in the list of criteria for determining BAT. So she could be the first runner of the inclusion of the value chain interaction into the BAT policy. So I'm very happy to hear her interventions. So please take the floor, Anne. Oh, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah. No, it seems.
Should be unmuted now.
But I can't hear you.
Still can't hear you.
Hello. She has some technical problems and voice. So, hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction. You all already mentioned that in Flanders, we also follow the BAT policy in the same way it is used at the European level. So in the BAT evaluation, there are 3 criteria evaluated. So the technical feasibility, the environmental impact or benefits, and the economic feasibility. So using the BAT policy, we always try to give special attention to the value chain aspects, the circularity aspects as well. And we do it in a practical way. So the value chain aspects are not taken into account as a separate or an additional criteria in the BAT evaluation, but we start to give in-depth description in the descriptive part of the techniques. What is the impact upstream and downstream when using a certain technique or a combination of techniques in installation? So in that way, we try to keep all the elements into account that can have an impact in the value chain. Most of the time, it's a qualitative description because, yeah, we are focusing on the sector aspects. But in that way, we try to keep in mind the value chain effects when evaluating the environmental impact criterion in the BAT evaluation. So in that way, we try to focus on those aspects in the most recent Flemish BAT reports without changing the existing BAT policy at the moment. So that's in the framework of our Flemish environmental regulations. And besides that, there's also a push from the Flemish government to set up programs taking into account those value chains aspects as well as the circularity aspects. And that is in the so-called Flanders Circular program. So there are different teams taking into account, for example, also the textile industry, where there is always a duo, one from the governmental side, one from the sector side, doing some in-depth analysis with focus on that circularity. And the third idea or the third thing that can be taken into account that are all the other regulatories or programs focusing on that value chain aspect. For example, Vito is now coordinating the SCURT project, and there they are taking into account the circularity approaches to and further reuse of textile issues. So it's not part of the BAT studies as such, but that are also important sources that can be linked when evaluating techniques in the framework of the BAT methodology. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for sharing your activity, relevant activities, as well as your ideas and suggestions about our activities. And I'm very happy to collaborate with you further for the next step. Thank you. So any other hands raised? Okay, so I'd like to introduce another comment from national delegate, Spence Seaman at the UK Environmental Agency. Spence has been actively joining our BAT activities and also is in charge of the UK environmental permit policy. And unfortunately, he gave up connecting this webinar due to some conflicts, but I received his message to be shared. So I'm reading his message now. The UK is developing its own BAT process that is known as UK BAT following their departure from the European Union. And that the approach is likely to seek expansion of the scope of existing BAT processes to potentially include climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and circular economy BAT conclusion. So very much following the great work put together via activity 5. So yeah, I have got such a very supportive comment, and I'm happy that our work is really in line with their exploration for developing the new BAT process. Okay, that's all for the session about the reflection from the national delegation. Then I would move on to the second part of this webinar, global work on improving the incorporation of value chain concepts into BAT policies, and to be focused on the one specific sectors in the textile industry. Okay, so now we are today inviting 2 external presenters. The first presenter is Mr. Lars Mortensen from the European Environmental Agency, EEA, and he will present an overview of environmental and climate impacts in the value chain for textile consumption in the EU, and the recent EU strategy on sustainable and circular textiles to address these impacts. So Lars, are you ready for now?
I am ready. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome everybody. It's good to see so many people here. I'm Lars Mortensen. I'm from the European Environment Agency. Together with my colleague Juan Calero, we've prepared the presentation to you on value chain impacts for textiles consumption in the EU and related policies, and we hope you like it. The next slide, just for those of you who don't know, the European Environment Agency. So we are an EU institution, and we basically have a mandate to monitor Europe's environment and climate. And me and my colleague Juan, we work on circular economy and industry team. I work a lot on circular economy and textiles, and Juan works a lot on the BAT and all of that work. So we've done this together. The member states of the agency is the EU plus others, so we cover that. On the next slide, I wanted to present to you 3 things this afternoon. Firstly, I want to talk about the value chain environmental and climate impacts from textiles from an EU perspective. Secondly, I would like to present to you the new EU strategy on sustainable and circular textiles. And third, I wanted to talk very briefly about a revised EU BREF and Industrial Emissions Directive. Unfortunately, Alex has mentioned a lot of that already, so it will make my life much easier, and he knows it much better than I do. So on the next slide, I've prepared for you an overview of the value chain impacts. And as you can see, this is really complex. Textiles is probably the sector with the most complex value chain and with the most embedded in the trade. As you know, most of textiles are produced in some regions of the world and a lot consumed in other regions of the world. I would say that basically impacts are from the resource inputs you can see on the top and from emissions you can see on the bottom. And they're from all parts of the value chain. Yeah? So from the production of fibers to the production of textile products, to the distribution of retail, the use of textiles, collection, sorting, and waste. And you know, inputs are agricultural land, water, biodiversity, chemicals, all that stuff. And outputs coming out is all kind of air emission, greenhouse gas emissions, waste, you name it. So it's really, really, really broad. And as I said, many of these are really embedded in the trade. So often does not happen in the country where the textiles are consumed, but in the country where it's produced and exported from. In the next slide, we have shown in the European Environment Agency how large are actually the impacts for textiles. And we're really happy that you're looking into taking this on board, of course. And what we've shown is that the European consumption of textiles has the 4th highest impacts on the environment and climate change on average, after food, housing, and mobility. So it's really huge. And it's one of top 3 pressures on water and land use, and one of top 5 pressures on raw materials and greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important for all of us now to address the textiles. In the next slide, I just wanted to show you one of the figures we've developed to show how big this is. This shows greenhouse gas emissions in the upstream value chain of EU household consumption. So this is are the greenhouse gas emissions in the whole value chain for the textiles consumed in the EU. What you can see here in more or less in the middle is in blue, that is the textiles. So 270 kilograms CO2 per person. Only 27% of that happens in the EU. The rest happens outside, and that makes it difficult in terms of a regulation. And what you can see here is that it's fifth biggest after housing, food, transport, etc. We have similar graphs for raw materials, water, and land use that shows that they're between third and fifth biggest, or on average the fourth biggest. So this is why we've looked at this. Is why a big reason why the Commission has developed a new strategy on textiles that I want to summarize for you in the next slide. Shows the heading of that. And then on the next slide again, I wanted to present to you the 8-9 elements of this strategy. So on 30th of March, the European Commission came out with a new strategy for EU sustainable and circular textiles. I would say this is a very, very ambitious strategy, embedding textiles in a lot of EU regulation. The first thing included in there is that the EU would like to set design requirements for textiles to make them last longer, easier to repair, exactly. And this is done through a revision of the Eco-Design Directive, the directive that is also used for windows and other things. So this is a big thing. Secondly, the EU wants to introduce clear information through a digital product passport and product policy for different types of products, including textiles. Third, there's a proposal to tackle greenwashing, to avoid greenwashing, to have like a commercial guarantee of durability and information on repair. And fourth is an aim, I would say, to reverse overproduction and overconsumption, and very concretely to work towards discouraging the destruction of unsold return textiles through a transparency obligation and possible bans. So this is very interesting. And on the next slide, I've listed the 5 other elements of this. So as you can see, this is quite a bit ambitious strategy with many really elements that will make a big difference to this industry. I'm very convinced. So the Commission proposes to develop extended producer responsibility for textiles with eco-modulation fees to do this in the revision of the Waste Framework Directive. It will address unintentional release of microplastic from textiles with binding requirements, and there will be proposals from this coming in during the summer. There will also be initiatives to try to restrict the export of textiles waste and to look into that. In the agency, we're going to look into where's the textile waste actually exported to, and how does all that. And then finally, the EU wants to incentivize circular business models, etc. So really ambitious strategy. This is a proposal from the Commission, and the different directives will have to go through the relevant processes. And this is an attempt to, I would say, embed textiles in mainstream policies in the EU. And that brings me to my final point, which is also on the EU policies, of course, on the next slides. So on the revised EU BREF and Industrial Emissions Directive. And Alex and Juan, you have to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an expert in this. So I'm just trying to summarize this the best we can for our non-EU audience here, I would say. On the next slide. So what we have is a final draft new EU textiles bad reference document. You can see on the left here for textiles, which has these bad conclusions covering what activities it covers, for example, coating, dry cleaning, fabric production, etc. And on the next slide, the bad conclusions yet to be adopted, basically general BAT conclusions, something on monitoring, water consumption and wastewater generation, energy efficiency, emissions to air, water and soil, waste management, chemicals management, consumption and substitution. And that brings me to my last slide of this presentation, which is on the revision of the Industrial Emissions Directive. I was not aware that Alex was going to introduce this, so he has said a lot of this, but this has been proposed. There's a focus on zero pollution with stricter focus on BAT emission levels, on chemicals management substitution, ECHA will have a role to highlight main hazardous chemicals. There's a focus on circular economy and resource efficiency, where environmental management will now have to take resource efficiency and circular economy into account. And there's some compatibility with climate policy to ensure energy efficiency measures are maximized. And on the last slide, I just say thank you for your attention. And me and my colleague Juan, we look forward to any discussions that we will see coming. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lars. It's a very concise but very informative, interesting presentation. Thank you so much. So the next speaker is next speaker is Miss Valerie Borten from Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The title is Rethinking Business Models for the Fashion Industry, and she's exploring the transition to a circular economy across the whole value chain of the textile sector. So Valerie, take the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Koki. Thank you for this introduction. I think I'm having some slides. There they are. Perfect. So yes, hello to all of you. My name is Valerie Borten and I work for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as you can see on this slide. We are an NGO, we're a charity focused on the circular economy. And since the Activity 5 report has identified circular economy as an approach, I was asked to speak a bit about what a circular economy actually is and what that can look like in the future. If you can just go to the next one, please. So, I mean, to understand what a circular economy is, we first need to understand what our current model looks like. We call this a take, make, waste model. If you can just go through, click on the slide, please. Yes, then you see the words appear. So we take resources, often finite ones, we take those out of the ground. We use those to make products, and actually we don't really use those products as much as we could. And at the end of this line, we end up with waste and pollution. Well, today we're here to talk about BAT, but actually the question is larger. If we want to tackle this problem here that we're seeing here, if we want to transform this model, we also need to think about our entire framework of regulations and policies and how we can reshape that to actually reflect a shift from what we're seeing here, so a pattern of very low utilization and low recycling, to one in which we actually keep our products and materials in use. If you can just go to the next one. So coming back to the sector that we're looking at here today, which is textiles. Our work is a bit more focused on fashion, but this graph, which is coming from our very first report on the industry, is actually relevant for all textile materials. We published it in 2017, but actually in recent years, there's more recent work done by Textile Exchange, amongst others, and that has unfortunately very much confirmed these numbers. So it's still very much the reality today, where we see, so the value chain today, very much virgin feedstock going in at the left, over 97%. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, actually, and not perhaps we're not really using our products nor materials to the maximum extent. There's numbers saying that we throw away our clothing after an average usage of 6 to 7 times. And at the end of that line, we see at the top left there, you can see less than 1% closed loop recycling. So that means less than 1% of sort of equal value recycling, where a textile fiber is recycled back into a textile product. So we heard earlier about what is a value chain, how we incrementally add value throughout these stages. This is what we're doing. We are adding value. We're extracting materials. We're then using them to make products. And at every step on the line, we add value. But then suddenly, once we have a product, that value tends to disappear. So it's all the energy, all the resources, the labor, the creativity as well that went into these products actually disappears, because there's very low levels of use and very low levels of recycling, unfortunately. And as your report that you were presenting today states, we actually have to think about not just sort of trying to improve this current model, lowering emissions in this current model or lowering environmental impacts in this one, but trying to think about overall solutions to design a better system. And a circular economy, we think, can be that overall solution. The next slide shows what that looks like. So for us, a circular economy is based on 3 principles. The first one is eliminating waste and pollution. From the very beginning, when we make design decisions, when we decide what a product will look like, what materials it contains, and so on, we need to think about possible pollutants, and that actually includes any fiber that may be released and that's non-biodegradable, so microplastics in particular. The second principle is about circulating, as the term circular economy says. You can see this on the next slide. So yeah, as the word very much says, making the most out of our products, out of our materials, keeping them in use for as long as possible, and in this way actually reducing the need for virgin resources. Then the final principle, which is one that we think is often a bit overlooked or forgotten when we talk about circular economy, is about regenerating natural systems. So circular economy relies on renewable resources above all when we do want to input virgin resources. And in an ideal world, in a circular economy, we produce these through regenerative methods, which means that we think about the quality of our ecosystems, of our soil, of our water, and so on. So replenishing resources rather than depleting them. The next slide is actually covering basic findings from a report we did in 2019, trying to link that vision of a circular economy to our actions on climate change. So circular economy obviously is based on the shift to renewable energy. However, switching to renewable energy would only actually, or not only, but would account for a 55% solution, let's say, in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the remaining 45% is actually linked to how we produce products, how we use products, how we produce the food that we eat and use as well, and how we manage land. And this is very much where the circular economy can come in and sort of complete the picture on the way to carbon neutrality and to reaching our climate objectives. Then just back to textiles on the next slide, we've been trying to apply this to make it a bit more concrete. We're quite aware that what we're setting out is a vision. It is a long-term goal. It's very aspirational. So we've tried to make this a bit more clear and a bit more tangible for textiles. Coming back to principles, so products should be used more, should be made to be made again, so that they can actually be used for longer, but they can also be recycled in practice. And importantly, their inputs should be safe. We heard from Charlotte about green chemistry before, but they should also be sourced from feedstocks that are either recycled or renewable. Getting to this picture requires a shift in business models, and that will be the focus of my second part of the presentation. Thank you. Circular business models, is a crucial piece of the puzzle, of course, in getting there. It is a circular economy, of course. We should not forget the word economy in there. So I'd like to present a few findings from a report we did at the end of last year. Thank you. Where here you can see on the slide how we actually understand circular business models. And again, going back, comparing that to today, where most business models operating in the textiles industry are actually linear, which means that for them to be successful, for them to generate more revenues, they actually rely on selling more products. So increasing sales, increasing the production of new products. And this is actually the link that we should try to break. So in a circular economy, business models or businesses can actually make money, they can generate economic activity without necessarily making new products, to put it very simply, or at least without necessarily consuming new resources, and especially finite resources. So it's about breaking that link and achieving that decoupling effect in practice. And of course, if we can achieve basically keeping products in use, if we can turn it into a business and economic opportunity, then that also eases the pressure on our resources, on biodiversity, and so on. So going back to our study, on the next slide, you can see the 4 examples of such circular business models that we looked into. This is not to say that these are the only 4 that exist, so to say. It's just that these are the 4 that we currently see in the market, the 4 models that we see currently gaining traction. Resale above all, but also rental models, repair and remaking. And remaking is where you take an existing piece of clothing, you use that existing fabric and you turn it into a new one. So no sort of mechanical recycling operations are involved. But of course, there are other circular business models, and there's a lot to say about the need to improve recycling, but also improve technologies to separate fibers, for example, or to actually improve the way that we sort used textiles. But we're not seeing yet the growth for these models, unfortunately, at this moment. So we focused on these 4 models, which are currently representing a $73 billion share of the market. And just on the next slide, if you could go through, thank you. Yeah, we've tried to quantify where the opportunity actually lies in the future. We're already seeing that, especially among younger generations, there's quite an enthusiasm to tap into these models, especially for resale. But what could this actually mean in the future? Where is the opportunity here? And it's quite a significant one, we found. So the result of our modeling shows that by 2030, these models taken together could take up 23% of the market. The next slide just summarizes, sorry, I forgot. The next slide adds to this economic opportunity also the environmental opportunity. We found, and this is based on figures by McKinsey and Global Fashion Agenda, that if we do shift massively to circular business models focused on keeping products in use, that could already account for 1/3 of the solutions needed to keep the industry in line with a 1.5 scenario. So 1/3 of the reduction in emissions needed. And of course, that would need to be coupled with other interventions more upstream in manufacturing. The next slide simply summarizes, thank you, key findings from our report. So a huge opportunity to grow up until 23% in the next 8 years. However, we also found that at the moment, while we're seeing these business models emerge, they're not fully realizing all the potential environmental benefits that they might have. If you can just click through, please. Yeah, and one more. Thank you. This is my final slide. Why is that? So why do we actually see these models coming up, but they're not fully realizing the effect of decoupling that I was describing earlier? Partly because they're, of course, still operating in the larger system, a larger economy that is very linear, including in a system they're sort of embedded in a regulatory and legal framework that is more or less designed for the linear economy. But there's also, of course, actions that businesses themselves can take to make this shift. And we've lined up 4 of these actions, of these ways forward, actually. Importantly, the first one is about rethinking performance indicators. So this is really about rethinking how we actually understand success, how we measure success for businesses. Can we move away from that focus on increasing sales, increasing turnover, but think about new indicators that actually measure the use, very simply, to what extent are products and materials used, or can we think about other indicators to measure that effect of decoupling in practice, to measure to what extent we're moving away from the need to extract virgin resources and the need to produce new products. Of course, linked to that, we need to work on design. We need to make sure that our products actually last longer, that they're made to be durable. We need to rethink supply networks, rethinking relationships with suppliers, but also thinking in terms of sharing information. We heard a bit about that earlier, traceability, tracking, and so on. And again, number 4, it's not just about the 4 models I listed today. We really have to keep our eyes and minds open and stimulate all possible innovations, because there's still a lot of material innovation and other technology innovation gaps that we still need to cross in order to build a full circular economy. And I just wanted to end with a note on policy. We heard a bit from Lars about the EU textile strategy. Very promising, for example, about the point on design, because this is an opportunity for policymakers to actually step in and help raise the bar on aspects such as durability. And this would be quite crucial because it would effectively also support manufacturers and suppliers who today don't have the necessary room for investment at the moment. So once there will be legally binding requirements on durability, that will really strengthen the business case for keeping products in use as well. And yeah, I think I will end there. Maybe just, again, if you would like to know more information, this report is available on our website. There's far more data than the small snapshot I shared today, but happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Valerie. Very cutting-edge study you have shared us, and it's very in line with our current activities and very helpful for thinking about the next steps. Thank you so much. So using the rest of the time, I would like to move on to the discussion sessions. We have already got some questions, but before picking up the question from the floor, I'd like to ask some questions to the speakers in terms of the synergy and the linkage with our works. So as Vera presented, we propose several possible next steps, including screening criteria. I think we need to set screening criteria or checklist to assess which technologies are determined as BAT for industrial installation in considering the value chain effect. So for example, please share my slide on screen, Christiana. So I will show you just my idea of the initial list of the screening criteria for the thought starter. I explored some criteria with a point of view of 4 global concepts addressed in the report: green chemistry, decarbonization, resource efficiency, and circular economy. For example, with a view of green chemistry and in considering the potential effect to the upstream chain, we might think about whether the candidate technology to be adapted at industrial installation as BAT needs materials that contain hazardous substances or not. And for downstream, we can think about whether the candidate techniques use hazardous substances which could be transferred to the product or not. Similarly, in considering the global climate impact, we can assess whether the potential BAT requires the change of upstream or downstream process which increase or decrease CO2 emissions. This kind of criteria or checklist would be generally evaluated qualitatively, but of course the quantitative assessment would be preferable. In this context, there is an advanced method in assessing CO2 emission. GHG Protocol Scope 3 proposes the method of calculation of CO2 emissions throughout the value chain that could be utilized for assessing value chain effect in determining BAT. However, when it comes to the circular economy, it is a bottom line. So many issues stem from the fact that we currently don't have an industry recognized definition or baseline standard for circular economy. So how can we move forward on this? What could potential indicators look like? Indicator can be utilized as a criteria in considering the value chain effect for determining the BAT. So the first question is for Valerie. Please provide you a point of view about the problem.
Yeah, thank you very much. Not an easy question, I know. I mean, we're quite aware that circular economy is a bit of a new concept. It's been coming through over the past decade or so. And it's, of course, building on a long legacy of sustainability thinking. And we talked a lot about LCA analysis today. So I think rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, it's perhaps also about seeing where we can add value and where circular economy can actually strengthen existing efforts without trying to duplicate elements, of course. The challenge with circular economy is that it's a systems thinking approach. That means that you can come up with indicators on a product level. You can design a perfectly circular product, but then that product also has to circulate in practice. So there needs to be an infrastructure and an actual business opportunity for that product to be used and reused and kept at highest value at all times. And this is where a difficulty lies, because it is difficult to come up with indicators that stretch across that entire value chain, where of course it's not always within one economic operator's control. So we think it's most helpful to actually start from the principles. That's why my presentation was quite principle focused, and then build indicators on that basis, but also bearing in mind that there is no sort of one size fits all solution. And I think the overall almost principle or idea to keep in mind is again the principle of decoupling. So can we actually reduce our reliance on virgin resources, in particular on finite ones, whilst still, of course, generating economic activity? So can we start measuring that in practice would be a key way forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Valerie. Yes, I agree that this is very difficult, but very important topics that we should push it further in the cooperation between us, and let us keep in touch and tackle these issues together. So I'll move on to the second question. It's for Lars. But both speakers shared with us a very informative knowledge on value chain impact from textiles. So I would like to have a next question is, how can the knowledge on value chain impacts from textiles be used to create BAT approaches and frameworks? I repeat it. How can the knowledge on value chain impacts from textiles be used to create BAT approaches and frameworks? So, Lars, you might have some suggestion, particularly regarding the screening criteria I showed from knowledge, but feel free to make an intervention to share your point of view broadly.
Thank you very much, Koki, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I fully agree. So we're looking at these screening criteria. I think these screening criteria look at some really essential elements. So it's really good. I like it. Of course, when you compare this screening criteria to all the value chain impacts, there are other impacts than these ones. And you cannot look at all of them at the same time. So that's the challenge. And I would say that, you know, these are really fundamental, so important. But of course, to the extent possible, the screening criteria should, over time at least, reflect other impacts as well. And for example, there's a decarbonization proposal in here. Of course, air emissions is also, you know, emission of air pollutants is also important. The water and the land use is also important. And on the circular economy, this is my final comment on this. There's a lot of focus on the recycling, which is very important. But as Value explained really well, circular economy is also about changing the whole system and avoiding that we have to recycle. So reusing things longer and longer. And of course, that's really difficult to embed. So maybe if you have your screening criteria, start working with them, and then you have the overall knowledge on the side, and maybe you can gradually add some more elements. That would be my suggestion in this really, really complex version. But I'm really happy to see what you've done. I think it's a great step forward. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, that's very helpful for us, and thank you so much for your supportive comments on our work on the screening criteria. And I'd like to ask the floor if you have if you have any reflection on this sort of startup criteria, please do provide your comments on the chat box. We can check it after the webinar and take it into consideration for our next activities. So thank you so much for your cooperation. And I'm really nearly running out of the time, but I would like to pick up some of the questions from the floor. From Key Fund, thank you for comprehensive picture. Please advise in more detail how to encourage the industry to collaborate and share information on that. So, Berak, please take the floor and answer this question.
Sure.
Briefly. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Key Fund, for the question. Well, from what I'd like to say right now, beyond the existing schemes that you can use to kind of see the information that's being shared, like the strategy that I presented, CLIS, that also includes business-to-business labeling. So aside these existing frameworks, what we identified is actually actively promoting existing best practices to highlight what the companies are doing and how they're doing it. and then following by awarding system, awarding programs that actually just gives awards to the installations for performing the way that they are doing, is one of the best ways of actually opening them up for more collaboration. But again, collaboration and sharing more information depends on the companies and industries themselves, and it's built on mutual trust and mutual benefits. So one of the works that we've also proposed through actually Vito's work is cluster studies, to actually identify industries that synergetically benefit each other. Could be also a better way of identifying and making them share more information about what they're doing. I don't know if that answers your question, but if you'd like more detail, please do refer to the chapter 5 of our report. We explain more details and more particular examples from other countries too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Spirax. So I just pick up one other comment at the last moment. So the next one is the IED proposal mentioned also suggests adding a requirement for transformation plan in 2030 to show how installations will contribute to the emergence of a sustainable, clean, circular, and climate neutral economy by 2050. So does the panel have any reflections on such a soft mechanism to foster changes? So if any panelists would like to make interventions to reflect on such a mechanism, yeah, of course, I acknowledge that there are several options that a regulator can take. It's the very obligational one or more softer approach. So what do you think about it? Does anyone have? So I like Sandra, please, do you have any reflection, ideas on how to?
If I can come in. Sorry, Sandra, go ahead.
Okay, I will initiate the conversation, add some thought. In general, I think the idea in terms of considering the value chain and the concept of regulation and about determination, much of it could be done as Anne was describing, where we're considering the impacts when we're considering the different techniques involved. So that supplemental information when we're making our determinations, I think really helps add clarity as to why we're recommending or stipulating a certain standard, and also allows for any flexibility in terms of how the industrial sector may evolve over time. And as well as supplementing that with any types of information products that may come out from future studies, to the extent that we can continually encourage through these case studies, success stories, even very generally, just to ease any type of concern with sharing of best practices. I think there is a way to generally promote these techniques and continuing to encourage that transition over. I'll go ahead and pass it over to you to add in comments.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Lars, do you want to add something? Were you speaking? No?
Did you say
I think,
okay.
Yeah.
Just on my side, just very quickly, I just wanted to add that I think, adding a requirement for a transformation, in the coming years is really useful because it provides a vision and a guidance on where to go. So overall, I like it, but Alex or my colleague Juan may have more specific views on this one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lars. And I'm so sorry, my poor management for the time management, and now we're running out of time. So I would like to close the session, but I apologize. I couldn't take one another question, but yeah, I acknowledge the importance to avoid ambiguous words, but yes, so that's exactly the point we'd like to overcome to develop the value chain for efficiency. So please do, so let us think together about how to overcome it in our next activities. So that's all from my end. Thank you so much for all your input and valuable discussion today. So that all should be very helpful for our next BAT activities. So, and thank you very much for providing us many comments and suggestions posted on the chat box. And we log them all and we'll take them into account for our future study. And in addition, we are always open to invite additional experts who are willing to be involved in our BAT project. So don't hesitate to contact us if you want to take part in it. So again, thank you so much for joining today, and do thank you, Sandra, Charlie, Valerie, and Lars for your excellent input.